Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this podcast. We are having straight talk and solving problems with leaders. My guest today is Dr. Richard Claydon. He is the Chief Cognitive Officer of EQlab, and he is joining us today from Hong Kong. Welcome, Richard. Thank you for being on this podcast.
Hi, I've just realised I don't know how to pronounce your name.
Dragica.
Dragica. Okay.
Dragica.
Hi, Dragica.
Right.
Great to be here.
Thank you for coming or joining us. So first, Richard, please tell us, what does a Chief Cognitive Officer do? What role do you play in business?
Well, what we're trying to do with EQlab is generate an accelerated learning environment where we can teach people to learn about the kind of stuff that they don't really learn about organizations in mainstream MBA programs, et cetera, et cetera. And my job is really to design how that works. So it's really, we have the chief executive officer whose job is to grow and scale the business. And my job is to do the intellectual work as to, well, given no one's tried to do roughly what we're doing before, what does that actually look like? And how do you do accelerated learning? How do you build a cognitive gym which gives people the mental muscles to do the kind of work that's necessary to drive organizations forward? How do we attract people who can contribute, etc.? So that's my job, is that sort of intellectual piece, and I don't have to worry too much about how it grows. The business side of it, that's the other team's job, basically.
Perfect. Before we get on to the real meat of the conversation, to talk about problem solving and so on, I want to ask you about the learning that you're talking about, because I share that interest with you, because I still do a lot of teaching and training and so on. But have you found, not just in the last couple of years, but even if you go beyond that to the last, maybe say 3 or 4 years, do you find that corporations' interest in learning is changing? Is there more interest in upskilling people, increasing capabilities? Is it level, or has it kind of slowed down? Less investment than there ever used to be?
I think so. I think probably both ends. I think that there was a trend of, and for many years, the trend has been, right, you take control of your human capital, and therefore you have to add to your capital by doing all your learning in your own time. Okay, so you make yourself a commodity through your learning, and you get all the accreditations, and then you create your own brand, as it were. So I think we've gone through a period of that. What we're seeing now, I think, is a sort of a real talent crunch. So that it's very, very difficult to get new talent and to keep them. So you've got both challenge attraction rates and attrition rates. And so what organizations are doing is, as part of the attraction, is, right, okay, you're going to get the opportunity to develop yourself within this organization, and we're going to have learning and development as a central part of the attraction package, rather than the old way, which was, it's your own job to take care of it. So I'm not sure if it's altruistic. I actually think it's because the talent shortage is real, and you've got to offer these kind of sticky bits and pieces around the edges of the core in order to get people to stay with you.
Yeah, that makes total sense. And actually, that's a beautiful lead into what I really want to talk about. The complexity of business. It has become such that sometimes you wonder, how does anybody wrap their mind around it all? But when you top the complexity off with the volatility, the uncertainty, and ambiguity on top of that, which are all sources of risk, and they all have to be managed with the right conditions and so on. So understanding the impact of complexity, volatility, uncertainty, and so on, and how strategy is going to be affected. Providing the why for effective leadership, I feel is really important, and not just in developing leadership, but also solving problems. So Richard, you say it's not about the why, it's about the how. And so some would maintain, and some outspoken people would maintain that we should be entirely clear on the need to define the why first if they want to thrive, especially now that we seem to be in a little bit of chaos in some businesses. People seem to always be putting out fires. Given the is it a why, is it a how, is it time for a new leadership model?
So this takes a lot of unpacking this question.
Yes.
So let's just first, my own work is very much related to the A of VUCA, ambiguity. So ambiguity is when there are multiple possible answers to the problem. So you don't know what's the right answer, but there are multiple experts and you sort of have to work out which one to listen to. And there's all kinds of emotional elements to that. You get lots of anxiety and anger and emotional defensiveness and things. And so we look at how do you do that with a degree of joy rather than with all of this kind of tension. So that's where my own research is situated. But if we go into VUCA, so VUCA has been around, I think, since 1987 as a terminology.
Long
and
while.
It emerges out of Warren Bennis's model of leadership. So if you look at the origins of the term, it was the US Army were reading Bennis's work, and Bennis basically said, we're organizations, and this is way back in the early 80s and even earlier, organizations are becoming far more complex, and therefore a certain leadership style is required. Okay, so the complex argument became VUCA with the US Army trying to establish a new way of understanding the sort of the post-Cold War environment. So that's what they grabbed from it. Bennis's ideas were prior to his sort of work. There were a couple of things going on in leadership. One was the classic sort of management model that leaders would sort of plan and control and strategize and sit in their sort of ivory towers and think all the time and do that kind of work, which Henry Mintzberg destroyed in his research on what leaders actually did. But you still had a lot of leaders, that they were being promoted, and that's what the assumptions were, that you were command and control and planning, et cetera. And then you had the contingency leadership stuff, which was coming out of Kurt Lewin's leadership styles work from the 1930s, where you sort of said, well, this style suits this situation. So the very simplest way to sort of describe that in terms of the ambiguity model, if you as the leader were the expert, then some kind of directive authoritarian style was correct, because the team underneath you needed to know what was to do and you were better than them at it, so you told them what to do and how to do it, and everything was good. If there were no experts, if there were lots and lots of experts, so if everybody was an expert, so a classic kind of siloed function where you've got an expert from each of these functions, then your job was to be quite delegative and laissez-faire. You allowed the team to make sort of, you pass the leadership into to different persons in the team, because each person had a different level of expertise, and you trusted them to run the process. And then the third model was if there were no experts, because it was too complex and ambiguous to have any experts, then you had to use a democratic model. And then you sort of had to go, everyone had to sit in a room and discuss and work out what was the right way of going forward. And then, of course, you also have the chaotic sort of moments when there are no experts but no time, which is when you sort of have to shift back into the authoritative kind of model. You say, well, I'm in a position of authority. I have to act because there's no choice. So that's sort of what was being wrestled with at the time. And Bennis said, right, because organizations are becoming more complex and the democratic style is suited to the complex regime, the people at the top of organizations had to be democratic in style. So that was his thinking. So it was sort of humanitarian, democratic, enabling everybody to become experts, enabling these problem-solving arenas where there were no expert, everyone was an expert and not an expert simultaneously, dealing with this sort of unknown. And so he was trying to create that kind of model of leadership. what's happened, because he was really aligned with humanistic psychology, which is the precursor of positive psychology. So what's actually happened is these sort of positive psychology movements have taken hold of that initial thesis. And this is where you get the why and the purpose coming in. So you've got this notion of a humanitarian democratic leader creating an organization that enables everybody. And what's one of the ways that you enable people? Well, one of the ways that you enable people is to give them purpose and meaning in their work. That's, and I don't think anyone would argue that that's not a good thing. The challenge is, what does that look like? Is it purely your own purpose and meaning being aligned with the organization's purpose and meaning? So basically they say, this is the purpose of the organization, this is the why, and then you just give up your own why and purpose and align with that organizational why. Or do they create conditions which can help you manifest your own purpose and your own why? And this is so I think that the first one, I think, is quite horrific, that you give up all purpose and meaning to the organization's vision. The second one, where the organization enables you to live a purposeful and meaningful life, and you find your own whys, and it's plural, not singular, I find that is an exceptional way to lead and to manage. So when I say it's not about the why, it's about the how. It's about how do you create these kind of conditions in which purpose and meaning manifest for absolutely everybody, rather than give up your purpose and meaning because the organization says this is the purpose and meaning you should align with. I hope that all made sense. That was a lot of unpacking very quickly.
It was, and I actually recognized the framework that you were talking about, and wondered if you were going to go there, which I'm glad you did. So in a very collaborative environment where leadership transfers all the time, right? So sometimes, you have to lead, other times you have to follow. Even as a leader, you might have to follow people reporting to you. How does the way that people are interacting in business now, sometimes not being sure if they're the leader or not, how does everything you just described impact how people collaborate? Or do they really? There's so much evidence that it's not really happening. There's a lot of talk about it. Okay, so you're nodding.
Yeah, so I think, what really good collaboration looks like and how collaboration tends to happen in organizations are two very different things. So I would divide collaboration into, I'd really call it collective performance. So what are we looking in terms of collective performance? And I would divide it into two different forms: collaboration and connection. So you've got to work on both. And good collaboration is really just, okay, there's no agenda other than a problem to be solved. Okay, and then you stay in the collaborative space until you've sort of worked out how you're going to, what the actual problem is, how are you going to begin to solve it, what experiments are going to be run, who's doing what, when they're going to do it by, etc., etc. So you've got that kind of, we just have a problem. We're not even sure if it's the right definition of the problem, but we are going to bring a bunch of brains into the room and we're going to sort of work on this for potentially a number of days. And the chats I've had with organizations that do this well suggest that pretty much the longer you spend in that space, the quicker the actual productive work that follows happens. So you could do, rather than just, we'll do a 1 hour brainstorming meeting and then we'll go off. We'll do 3 days in a collaborative space and then we'll go off and do the work. But the amount of time you save doing it when you've gone off and do the solo work is enormous, based because of how much collaborative work you've actually done up front. So you've got to have that going on as what really good collaboration looks like. And I think there's a whole bunch of methodologies and techniques that you can use to keep conversations going, etc. I think very few organizations do it well. You then got the connection work, which is how do I build trust and relationships within the organization? And I think a lot of this has been stripped away over the last number of years. And connection work is literally, do I break bread with my colleagues? Do I have cups of coffee with them? Do we go and have lunch together? Do we chat around big tables, pre-work, during work, after work, without necessarily being observed by people who think that we're not working, we're not sitting on our computers? And again, you see a huge, by enabling that as part of the work, you see these kind of almost collaborative, informal collaborative conversations happening where people learn from each other informally. Oh, you do it this way, I'm going to try it that way, etc. So you see this building of knowledge, building of capacity, but you also see the strengthening of relationships and the generation of trust. You've got companies who sort of really game it, like Google. So Google would they would engender these kind of cross-functional conversations by providing loads of free food. So obviously breaking bread together is pretty normal, but also by making it take three minutes or so to get the food. So you're queuing up next to somebody and you open a conversation with them, and then it becomes a ritual that you continue that conversation with someone you may have never spoken to before, and you eat lunch together. And so you get that kind of cross-pollination of ideas. And again, I don't see many companies and more traditionalist companies encouraging that kind of behavior. What I tend to see is, oh look, you're eating lunch at your desk because you're a good worker and you're so busy, rather than this kind of work. So they're the two things I think are required for great collective performance, and I would agree with you that not many organizations do it particularly well at the moment.
No, very, very true that. I've had the good fortune of working with some of the very, very traditional organizations where I would be kind to say that a lot of dysfunction exists, particularly when it comes to certain behaviors. But then, looking at some of the Googles, the Facebooks, the Amazons of this world are very different than the traditional. But so much of the world is still made up of some very traditional behaviors in organizations. And one of the things that I observe is you've got, interns coming in, and some of them are not, fresh in their early 20s out of their MBA programs. Some of them are a little bit older. And what I'm observing, and I'd really, like to hear your comment on, is, say between the age of 25 and 35, are your up and coming leaders, and they're being put into positions of managing other people. And they don't know what behaviors to adopt. They don't know what behaviors to model, because if they're coming out of school, if they're coming from a traditional company going into a new company, or a new company going into something more traditional. For example, if you're going from a software company into an insurance company, and this is a most recent example, it was totally befuddling to the person coming in. I think he was like around 32 or 33, just didn't understand what behaviors were appropriate. It almost seemed like, if you do the right thing, you did the wrong thing. If you did the wrong thing, you still did the wrong thing. So what guidelines do people look for? Where do they find them? I mean, I guess this takes you back to the earlier comments about people have to learn, and adapting behaviors is a skill, would you say?
Well, I think, to know what guidelines are appropriate, or what behaviors are appropriate, in theory, it should be pretty simple. Is be civil, be collaborative, contribute to your own work, but contribute to others' work.
But nobody teaches that. Nobody teaches that.
No, and so what we have is you're talking specifically about MBA students, and I do teach in a future-focused MBA program, which the first 4 modules are behavioural based, but this is very rare. So what you normally have in an MBA modules is you do your functional stuff. So this is all, again, it's the classic planning, controlling. This is what a management looks like, etc. So you do all the functional stuff, and you learn all about the functional aspects. You learn your finance, you learn your HRM management, you learn your strategy, you learn your marketing. You do all the functional stuff. And then maybe you'll do a couple of behavioral electives. So I teach leadership behaviors, but you could also do organizational behavior, which I've also taught. But they're not they're not front and center. And what the evidence and has done for the last sort of 40 years is suggests that high performing teams are run by people who understand the human dimensions of work. But that's not the mainstream way of teaching and understanding things. Business schools don't teach that. They still teach the classic functionality.
Yeah.
It's not set core. It's an elective if it is taught. And even then, it's becoming a very, very hyper specialized elective where you only get psychologists teach it. You don't get the wider behavioral disciplines like social psychology or anthropology. You don't get a deep dive into the history of management and the history of leadership. It becomes, so I've seen this with programs, is anything that's over 7 years old is an irrelevant piece of data. It's only the new stuff. So there's no historical validity in what gets taught. So that at the teaching level, that's the problem. The business schools are not. And they're also not teaching complexity as a core element in my experience, at least. I've been told it's a marginal perspective that I can include when I'm teaching, but it's not. I can't front everything up with organizational complexity and this is how you navigate it. It's sort of it's somewhere else. You can include it, but not as core. So I think what we need to be teaching and everything I try to do is. You teach people about complexity sciences, everything around or what it means to navigate complex systems, complex adaptive systems. I would tend to use a network society, a networked organization. That's one element. What is the environment you're living in? And then the second element is, well, what are the human behaviors you're expecting to see in those environments? What works, what doesn't work, where is the power, where's the politics, all of this kind of stuff. How do you navigate and negotiate this? How do you understand yourself? How do you understand others? But it's not central in any training that I've come across. And when we pitch to clients, we'll have two responses very, very much. One will just go, oh my God, that's amazing. Please come in and help us do this. And the more standard response is, no, we want this leadership model. We're very specifically wanting you to teach this, and it's very narrow. It's something that they've read or they're interested in or they've been taught, and you're sort of going, well, okay, that's going to cause, it's an interesting model, but only when embedded in the wider context. So you can understand it in the wider context of work, but if you're just trying to teach that model, you're going to get into trouble because it doesn't actually help you understand the complexity of the organizational complexity that you're trying to deal with. So that's sort of, again, I'm not sure I answered the question particularly well, but that's what I'm seeing in the L&D environment and the wider MBA program environment as well.
Because one of the main reasons why I think this is an important topic, particularly around behaviors and everything to do with social and complexity and so on, is, I'm encountering far too many organizations that have what appears to me far too many problems to solve. And it seems to me that there's way too much focus on yesterday's problems rather than trying to figure out what the opportunities are to chase. And, so I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on, well, it kind of comes down to a couple of things. Why are there so many problems? And what is it going to take to try and solve them all, which is a horrendous task? Or maybe we should have a lot more focus on how do we prevent them in the first place?
I think the problem is literally, it's just associated with complexity. We are shifting, as we shift further and further into the digital age, we're going to get more and more complexities. The interconnectionness and the interdependencies of the world are going to create complexities. So every time you get complexities, you're going to get problems. If work from home and remote working become absolutely commonplace, that's just going to add to the complexities of getting people to talk to each other properly, but also how do you get talent, because talent can be from all over the world, and because they can connect together through. So there's every opportunity creates a bunch of other problems around the outside that you have to start solving. And we look backwards because all of the stuff we're taught about businesses historically is in this linear kind of model rather than this interdependent model. So we're doing a big shift from what Niels Pfeffing calls the Taylor bathtub into this interdependent, interconnective kind of business world. And the argument is what we're actually seeing is the return to a more a pre-industrial kind of craft society, but with the whole globe as that society. So what you then have is you have every single part of your market can be attacked by other craftsmen. You've got to have these abilities to find the niches, to produce solutions in those niches, and it's about rapidly doing it rather than this traditional kind of planning. So it's the global village. It's seeing organizations as sort of craft workers in the global village, and being able to respond to the demands around the craft, knowing there are many other craft workers, and that there's these interdependencies between companies that we have to move towards. And I don't think we're so I think people are beginning to realize this. I mean, you're seeing, largely because of COVID, this deep more interdependence and interconnectivities, and because everyone's now bought the digital infrastructure, and rather than flying people around the world, etc., you're recognizing that this is going on more. What's happening is hours are just being pushed out to ridiculous lengths because people don't care about time zones, etc., etc. So we're seeing this push into something that's going to have to break. And that's when the big reimagination is going to happen. And I already have some clients who are just saying, look, I'm just at the end of my mental energy. I'm totally exhausted. I'm working from, I get up at 7 for the last American call of the day, but then I have to deal with an American call at 10 o'clock at night, and I don't see my family, I don't see my wife, I don't, all of this kind of stuff. So we're seeing this take us to breaking point within these interdependencies of the world, and there are possible solutions. So one of the solutions that we're seeing is this implementation of borders. So actually you're looking at, how do I bring all of the work back into the local area, etc., rather than this sort of global supply chain network. But I don't think that's going to work long term. What is going to work long term is a deeper understanding of the network as an organization, as a network, as probably a rhizomatic network of interconnected people doing interesting work. And then you've got to look at, well, how the control functionality. So will we go back? Will we use the current technology to go back to these classic command and control kind of functions from the 1900s, which is very possible. We're definitely seeing a rise in this kind of thinking. Just use the platform to control everyone. Or will we see an adaptive kind of organization where people at the edges are given the opportunity to explore niches and ways to go forward? And we're seeing that as well. We're seeing a number of organizations do that as well. I would argue that those organizations are the ones that are creating the most value, the ones that are doing this kind of edge-based work and connectivity and ethics well. But they are by far the minority. Most organizations are still buying digital platforms as a control mechanism, and you sort of see that from the amount of monitoring software that's come in with people working from home, and even at the level of the keystroke, you're being monitored. So you're just looking at a human as a cognitive cog in the organizational knowledge machine, rather than as a sense-making entity that can work at the edges and help you find opportunities. And I could talk about this for hours and we don't have time, but you've basically got, you could actually look at organizational histories for the last 200 years, and you've got these two systems running in parallel. The mainstream one has always been the command and control and the linear, but underneath it, you've just got continuous examples of this connective, working at the edges, adaptive kind of organizations, which have always succeeded. They're just not part of the mainstream literature and the mainstream training. And you're seeing more and more of it move into the mainstream. So it might be something that happens in the next 10 years or so.
And here's me for the last, at least 15 years or so. I've been trying to promote the idea that we have to be much more adaptive, not to always think about continuous improvement. There comes a point in time where you reach the end of the rope, quite frankly. And you have to start really thinking about being much, much more adaptive than just, thinking about continuous improvement. So to wind it up, Richard, because you do look into the future a fair bit with both people, technology, behaviors, and all of that. So what do you think are maybe a couple of risks that organizations, whether they're traditional or much more modern collaborative type environments, what are a couple of risks that you see coming at us that people just might miss? If
I mean, the biggest risk globally is you're not going to get people to do who can capable of doing the work. I mean, that's undoubtedly the biggest risk. So that this big talent crunch that's coming, and this is not just the talent crunch of highly specialized people. I mean, this is frontline customer-facing workers who just go, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm not just going to follow. I'm an autonomous, independent person. I'm not going to follow this command and control structure. You must behave like this in every instance, and here's the script that you must follow with no deviation. They're just going to go, I'm not going to do that anymore. I'm going to do something else. I'll go. So I think that so if you lose those people, and I think you're also going to lose so IT people. I mean, there's a great intent to quit within the IT world at the moment. So if you can't have customer-facing people and you can't hire them, and if you can't hire the digital workers, the IT people who put those infrastructures up, you cannot grow, you cannot scale. Okay, so we all think about talent as all these other people with all these specialisms, but you can't grow without the frontline workers, the customer-facing workers, or the people who can build your digital infrastructure. So I think that's risk number one: is where you've got to start treating these people better. You've got to start giving them more autonomy, because without them, growth is going to be impossible. That's the biggest risk, and I think it's arguably the US that has the biggest risk out of all countries at the moment, because it's quite an exploitive way of treating them. There isn't a safety net. They just, and I think you're seeing the anti-work movement already in the US, and then the Reddit threads, and people just go, I'm not going to do this anymore. This is, I've just had 2 years of a terrible life because of COVID, and I'm being expected to hold down two customer-facing jobs simultaneously in order just to make ends meet, and all the risks and the tiredness and the exhaustion. I'm just not. I mean, you know what? Still don't make enough money after doing 2 jobs, so I'll just do one. And you're going to see this big shift in the way we treat frontline digital workers. So I think that's risk number one, and risk number 2 is the training and development of people sticks to the classic functional way of training and developing people.
Doesn't work anymore.
It just doesn't work anymore. So we that's part of the shortage is that we're not training people to understand the contemporary context of organization, so they feel like a fish out of water in most organizational environments, and then these people, this is where a lot of the challenges of mental well-being come in. They suffer the anxiety and the overwhelm of I'm trying to do this work and I'm really actually lost in the environment that I'm in. So I think that's the second one, is we need to radically shift the way we train people, so that they're able to cope with this oncoming, more adaptive, interdependent environment.
Brilliant. I think I will say this. I agree with you on the 2 risks. but I don't think I have heard anyone identify those before. And I think you're spot on that those are two. I mean, everybody's talking about it, but nobody's really saying, I think we're at risk that we're not going to have the talent. We're not going to have the people are just going to walk away. I don't think anybody's actually saying this could be a big deal.
The focus is on the wrong thing. The focus has been on the technology will automate everything. And what you're actually looking at, so you've got this, people are still there. So you've got this technology is going to automate everything, and we're going to be able to downsize. That's the classic kind of thing is, right, technology will automate, we can get rid of people, etc., etc. What is actually happening, and what always happens when technology changes, is it creates more jobs. Yeah. It's always happened. You always have, it's going to destroy jobs. It's actually creating more jobs. But the way it's creating more jobs is it's the way it's impacting the planet anyway, is it's creating jobs that require more autonomy and because it's not the technology can do all of the heavy routine process stuff. And what we actually need to do is the human stuff around the edges. And if your technology is working, you're going to get more and more human stuff around the edges that the technology can't do. And that's what we're lacking. So you've got to accept, right, the more I invest in the technology, and it's going to help me grow, but at the same time, growth means there's going to be more jobs. And they're locked together. And what I've seen in over the last number of years, every time I present it, is everybody only cares about the tech. No, I'm very often the only person in the conference, Future of Work conference, talking about the people. Everybody else is talking about technology. And you've got to link them together. The technology is going to create more jobs. Every technology ever always has. This one is unlikely to be different. Yeah. Wow. Fabulous insights. Richard, I thank you very much for joining me and for this fabulous conversation. And I hope to connect with you again soon. It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you again. Okay. Bye now. Bye-bye. And here you have it. That winds up our post for this week. And great thanks to my guest, Dr. Richard Claydon, coming to us from Hong Kong today. And look for our next post in the coming week. Bye for now.